We always went camping. It was our tradition since the last years of high school, and we had continued doing it religiously for the 6 years that followed. Every summer, without fail, my 3 best friends and I would pack our backpacks, load Andres' car with enough supplies for a week, and head to some remote forest to disconnect from the civilized world for a few days. My name is Juan, and until 2 years ago, those camping trips were the highlight of my year. We were a tight-knit group. Andres, who had always been our natural organizer and designated driver. Miguel, the group's joker, who could make anyone laugh even in the worst circumstances. Carlos, the quietest among us, but also the most observant. And me, who usually ended up being the mediator when small disagreements arose about which trail to take or where to set up camp. We had explored dozens of forests over the years, the Picos de Europa, the Sierra de Guadarrama, the Pyrenees, and plenty of smaller natural parks. We always sought out remote places, far from official campsites and tourists. We loved the feeling of being truly alone in nature, relying solely on ourselves for a few days. The last trip we took together was to a forest in the province of Soria. Andres had found references to a mountainous area that supposedly had spectacular hiking trails, but rarely received visitors due to its difficult access. It seemed perfect for us, remote, challenging, and completely untouched. It was late July, and the heat in Madrid had been unbearable for weeks. The idea of spending a few days in the mountains, surrounded by pines and fresh air, sounded like paradise. We had planned to stay for 5 days, from Wednesday to Sunday, enough time to do several long hikes and truly unwind. Early Wednesday morning, we loaded Andres' Seat Leon with our usual gear: 4 backpacks, 2 two-person tents, sleeping bags, a portable gas stove, dehydrated food for several days, plenty of water, and all the hiking equipment we had accumulated over years of trips. The drive to Soraya was as usual: constant jokes, loud music, frequent stops to stretch our legs and buy snacks. Miguel kept us entertained for the first hour by imitating our high school teachers. Carlos occasionally chimed in with sarcastic remarks that made us laugh, and Andres kept up a steady stream of commentary about other drivers and the landscapes we were passing through. We arrived at the area around noon. The forest was exactly as Andres had promised: dense, mountainous, and seemingly deserted. We had parked on what could barely be called a trail, more like a forest track that looked like it hadn't been used in months. The only signs of human activity were some old tire marks in the dried mud and a couple of cigarette butts that could have been there for years. "Perfect," Andres said as we unloaded our backpacks. "This is exactly what we were looking for." Miles and miles, without seeing anyone. We had topographic maps of the area, but they were fairly basic. The plan was to hike into the forest for about 2 hours, find a suitable clearing near a stream, and set up our base camp from which we could do daily excursions. The first few kilometers of hiking were spectacular. The forest was dense and varied, with a mix of pines, oaks, and beeches, creating a canopy so thick that barely any sunlight reached the forest floor. The air was fresh and clean, filled with the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Occasionally, we heard birds, but other than that, the silence was almost complete. After about an hour and a half of hiking, we found the perfect spot: a small clearing next to a stream that ran clear and cold. There was enough space for our 2 tents, a flat area for cooking, and easy access to water. The surrounding trees provided good protection from the wind, and there were several fallen logs that could serve as natural seats around a campfire. "This is ideal," Carlos said, dropping his backpack with a sigh of relief. "Fresh water, good drainage, sheltered from the wind. You couldn't ask for anything better. We spent the rest of the afternoon setting up camp and exploring the immediate surroundings. Andres and I pitched the tents while Miguel and Carlos gathered firewood for that night's campfire. By sunset, we had a fully functional campsite and a substantial reserve of dry wood. That first night was exactly what we expected. We cooked a simple dinner on the gas stove, lit a campfire when it got dark, and spent hours talking and laughing as the stars gradually appeared in the clear sky. The forest at night had its own sounds: owls hooting in the distance, the occasional rustle of branches when some animal moved through the underbrush, the constant murmur of the stream. "This is the life," Miguel said, leaning back against a log with a beer in hand. "No traffic, no bosses, no phones. Just us and nature." The next 2 days followed the perfect pattern we had established over years of camping. We woke up early, ate breakfast by the stream, and then set out on long hikes to explore different parts of the forest. In the afternoons, we returned to camp, relaxed, cooked, and spent the evenings around the campfire. The forest was more expansive than we had anticipated. It seemed to stretch in every direction without clear boundaries, with deep valleys, rocky ridges, and winding streams that formed a natural labyrinth. The maps we had turned out to be less detailed than we would have liked, but that only added to the sense of adventure. During our excursions, we found several notable spots: a small but beautiful waterfall hidden in a ravine, a rocky lookout that offered spectacular views of the valley, and the remains of what appeared to be an old lumberjack's cabin, now completely overgrown with vegetation. It was Friday night when things started to get strange. We'd had a particularly good day exploring the northern part of the forest, and we'd returned to camp later than usual, just as the sun was setting. While we were preparing dinner, Carlos mentioned something that made me uneasy. "Did any of you notice those marks on the trees today?" he asked. "What marks?" Andres replied. "They looked like cuts or scratches, but very deliberate. Like someone had been marking a trail." Miguel laughed. "Probably bears sharpening their claws." "No," Carlos insisted. "They were too uniform, too regular, and they were at human height, not animal height." I had noticed the marks Carlos was talking about, but I hadn't thought much of them at the time. Now that he mentioned it, he was right. They were oddly regular and seemed intentional. "Probably from previous hikers," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "People marking their route so they wouldn't get lost on the way back." "Maybe," Carlos said, but he didn't sound convinced. That night, as we sat around the campfire, I noticed Carlos was quieter than usual. He kept looking out into the darkness of the surrounding forest, as if listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. "You okay?" I finally asked him. "Yeah, just, does anyone else get the feeling we're being watched?" Miguel laughed. "Carlos, man, you're being paranoid. We're in the middle of nowhere. The only thing watching us is the owls." But even as Miguel joked, I could tell he was occasionally glancing toward the trees with a slightly uneasy expression. "It's just the darkness," Andres said. "It always makes you feel more vulnerable when you're in a new place. Tomorrow, when we can see everything in daylight, you'll feel different." We went to bed around midnight. Andres and I shared one tent, Miguel and Carlos the other. Normally, I'd fall asleep instantly when camping. There's something about the fresh air and physical exertion that makes sleep come easily. But that night, I lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the nighttime forest. Around 2 a.m, I heard something that made my heart race. It was the sound of footsteps, definitely human footsteps, moving slowly around the perimeter of our campsite. I stayed completely still, holding my breath and straining to listen. The footsteps continued for several minutes, pausing occasionally as if whoever it was examining our camp from different angles. "Andres," I whispered. "What?" he replied immediately, and from his tone, it was clear he'd been awake and listening too. "Do you hear that?" "The footsteps." "Yeah." We stayed silent, listening. The footsteps continued for another 5 minutes, then gradually faded into the distance. "Probably a lost hiker," Andres whispered, but he didn't sound convinced. "At 2 in the morning. People do stupid things when they're lost." Neither of us mentioned the incident to Miguel and Carlos the next morning. There was no physical evidence that anyone had been near our camp, and we didn't want to alarm them unnecessarily. But both Andres and I were more alert during the day, paying closer attention to our surroundings than we normally would have. Saturday passed relatively normally. We decided to explore the southern part of the forest, following the stream downstream to see where it led. We found more evidence of previous human presence, the remains of a campfire that seemed to have been used recently, some bits of trash buried under leaves, and even what looked like the remnants of an improvised campsite. "Definitely not the first people to be here," Miguel observed as he examined the fire's remains. "These embers don't look that old," Carlos added. "Maybe a week, tops." The idea that other people had been camping in the area recently should have been comforting, but for some reason it made me more uneasy. There was something about the way the campsite had been abandoned that seemed rushed, like the people had left quickly without properly cleaning up. That night, we decided to keep the campfire going longer than usual. No one said it explicitly, but we all seemed reluctant to go to sleep. Even Miguel, who was usually the first to announce he was tired, kept adding wood to the fire and suggesting another round of beers. Around 11, we heard something that made us all freeze. Human voices in the distance. They were indistinct, too far away to make out words or even determine how many people were talking. But they were definitely human voices, and they seemed to be moving through the forest in our general direction. "Night hikers?" Miguel suggested, but his tone was tense. "No one hikes in the dark unless they're lost or running from something," Carlos said. The voices continued for about 20 minutes, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, as if the group was zigzagging through the forest. Occasionally, we could hear the sound of branches snapping, suggesting they were moving through dense vegetation rather than following established trails. "We should put out the fire," Andres said suddenly. "Why?" Miguel asked. "Because if there are people lost in the forest, they're going to see the light and come here looking for help. And if they're not lost..." He trailed off. We doused the campfire and sat in silence in the darkness, listening. The voices continued for another 10 minutes, then gradually faded into the distance. "They probably just passed by," Andres said, after we hadn't heard anything for a while. But none of us felt comfortable going to sleep right away. We stayed up in the dark for another hour, whispering about whether we should consider packing up and leaving in the morning. "It's our last day anyway," Carlos pointed out. "Maybe we should cut the trip short and leave tomorrow morning." "We're not going to let some random hikers ruin our trip," Miguel said, but even he sounded less convinced than usual. Finally, around 1 in the morning, we decided to try to sleep, but we agreed that whoever heard anything suspicious would immediately wake the others. Sunday morning dawned cloudy and gray, which suited our collective mood perfectly. We had all slept poorly, and there was a tension in the air that was palpable. Even Miguel, who usually woke up full of energy and ready to joke, was quiet and pensive. We decided to do one last short hike before packing up and leaving. The plan was to explore a small valley to the east of our campsite that we'd seen from the rocky lookout, but hadn't had time to investigate properly. We packed light snacks and enough water for a few hours, leaving most of our gear at the campsite. We planned to be back by lunch, then pack everything up and start the drive back to Madrid in the afternoon. The valley turned out to be more interesting than we'd expected. It was deeper and more expansive than it appeared from above, with several small streams joining to form a larger one. The vegetation was different too, denser, with more ferns and moss, creating an atmosphere that was beautiful but also slightly ominous. We'd been exploring for about an hour when Carlos suggested we should probably start heading back. "It's a beautiful valley," he said, "but there's something about this place that's making me nervous." Miguel laughed, but it wasn't his usual energetic laugh. "Carlos, man, you've been nervous since we got here." "And I've been right," Carlos replied. "We've heard weird voices, footsteps at night, found evidence of other people being here recently. Maybe we should trust our instincts." Andres checked his watch. "It's 11:30. Let's say we explore just a bit more, until noon, then head back. That'll give us plenty of time to pack up and leave." We continued following the main stream downstream for another 20 minutes. The valley gradually narrowed, with rocky walls rising on either side. It was beautiful, but it also felt increasingly claustrophobic. That's when we found something that made us all stop dead in our tracks. Ahead, where the stream took a sharp bend around a large rocky formation, there was what was clearly an occupied campsite. We could see smoke from a campfire rising through the trees, and there was clothing hung on a rope between two pines. "Shit," Miguel whispered. "There are people here." "Should we say hello?" Andres asked. "No," Carlos said immediately. "Something about this doesn't feel right. Why would anyone camp at the bottom of this valley? It's damp, hard to reach, and there are no good views." He was right. The campsite's location was odd. Any experienced hiker would have chosen a higher, drier spot to camp. "Maybe we should head back the way we came," I suggested. But before we could move, we heard voices coming from the campsite. They were male voices, multiple, speaking in low tones we couldn't make out. "Hide," Andres whispered, and we all crouched behind some large bushes. From our hidden position, we could partially see the campsite. There were at least 3 men visible, all dressed in camouflage clothing. One was handling what looked like electronic equipment, another was organizing what appeared to be supplies, and the third was holding what definitely looked like a rifle. "Hunters," Miguel whispered. "In July," Carlos replied. "And with that kind of gear, they're not regular hunters." We watched for several more minutes. The men moved with an efficiency that suggested military or police training. Their campsite was set up to be almost invisible from most angles, and they'd chosen a position that gave them a clear view of anyone approaching through the valley. "We need to leave," I whispered. "Now." Very slowly, we started to back away, staying crouched and moving as quietly as possible. We'd managed to get about 50 meters away when a branch snapped under Miguel's foot. The sound, though small, seemed impossibly loud in the valley's silence. Immediately, the voices from the campsite stopped. "Run," Andres whispered, and we all stood up and started sprinting back the way we'd come. We could hear activity behind us, voices shouting, sounds of people moving quickly through the forest. But we didn't stop to look back. We ran for what felt like an eternity, leaping over fallen logs, dodging low branches, slipping on wet rocks. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode, and my lungs burned from the effort. Finally, after what must have been 15 minutes of non-stop running, we stopped to catch our breath behind a large rocky formation that provided cover. "Do you think they followed us?" Miguel panted. We listened carefully, but we couldn't hear anything except our own pounding hearts and heavy breathing. "I don't know," Andres said, "but we're not sticking around to find out. We need to get back to the campsite, pack up, and leave immediately." The rest of the trek back to our campsite was a mix of fast walking and short sprints. We kept looking over our shoulders, expecting to see figures following us, but the forest seemed empty. When we finally reached our campsite, we all felt an immense sense of relief. Our tents were still where we'd left them, our gear was untouched, and there were no signs anyone had been there in our absence. "Pack everything up and let's get out of here," Carlos said, already starting to dismantle his tent. We worked with an efficiency born of panic, throwing items into our backpacks without the careful organization we normally used. In less than 30 minutes, we had completely broken down the campsite and were ready to leave. "Everyone got everything?" Andres asked, taking one last look around the clearing. "Yeah," we all said at once. "Then let's go." We started the trek back to where we'd left the car, moving as fast as our loaded backpacks allowed. The forest, which had seemed beautiful and serene just hours earlier, now felt threatening and claustrophobic. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. We'd been hiking for about an hour when we realized Carlos was no longer with us. "Where's Carlos?" Miguel asked, stopping and looking around. Andres and I stopped too and looked back down the trail. There was no sign of Carlos. "He was right behind me 5 minutes ago," Andres said. "Carlos," Miguel shouted. "Don't shout," I said quickly. "If those guys are still out there." We waited, listening, but there was no response. "Maybe he stopped to adjust his backpack," Andres suggested. "Let's backtrack a bit." We walked back down the trail for about 200 meters, calling Carlos's name in whispers, but there was no sign of him. "This isn't right," Miguel said, and I could see panic starting to form in his eyes. "Maybe he took a different trail," I said, though I knew it was unlikely. We'd been following a fairly clear path, and Carlos wasn't the type to wander off without saying something. "What do we do?" Miguel asked. Andres looked torn. "We can't leave him here, but we also can't risk all of us getting caught by those guys." We decided to search for another 30 minutes. If we couldn't find Carlos by then, we'd head to the car and contact the authorities. We spent the next half hour shouting Carlos's name and looking for any sign of where he might have gone. We checked side trails, looked behind large rocky formations, even backtracked toward our old campsite in case he'd returned there for some reason. But it was as if Carlos had simply vanished. When it became clear we weren't going to find him on our own, we made the difficult decision to head to the car and involve the authorities. The trek back to the car was one of the hardest experiences of my life. Every step felt like a betrayal, like we were abandoning our friend. But we also knew that if something had happened to Carlos, we needed professional help to find him. We reached the car just as the sun was setting. We immediately drove to the nearest town and went straight to the local police station. The officers took our report seriously, especially when we described the armed men we'd seen in the valley. They organized a search team that included local police, forest rangers, and even a helicopter. "We'll find your friend," the sergeant leading the search assured us, "but I need you all to head back to Madrid. If there's criminal activity in that forest, we don't want more civilians in danger." We drove back to Madrid that night, but none of us could sleep. We spent the next few days glued to our phones, waiting for updates from the police. For 3 days, there was no news. The search teams had combed the entire area where Carlos had disappeared, but they hadn't found any sign of him. They'd also located the campsite in the valley we described, but it was empty when they arrived. The armed men had vanished, leaving only a few empty cans and cold campfire ashes behind. It was Wednesday morning, exactly 5 days after Carlos had disappeared, when we got the call we'd been waiting for. "We found him," the sergeant said. "He's alive, but he's in the hospital. You should come." We drove back to Soria immediately, our minds racing with questions about what had happened and what condition Carlos would be in. We found him in the regional hospital, conscious but clearly in shock. He had several cuts and bruises, was dehydrated, and had lost noticeable weight, but physically, he seemed relatively okay. "Carlos," Miguel said, rushing to his bedside. "Man, what happened? Where have you been?" Carlos looked at us with an expression I'll never forget. It was a mix of relief, confusion, and something I can only describe as residual terror. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't remember." Over the next few hours, as Carlos recovered, we were able to piece together a partial story of what had happened. According to Carlos, the last thing he clearly remembered was walking behind us on the trail back to the car. Something in his backpack was bothering him, so he'd stopped to adjust it. When he looked up, he could no longer see us. "I called your names," he told us, but no one answered. So I tried to catch up, but I must have taken the wrong trail at some point. But from that point, his memories became blurry and fragmented. "I remember being lost," he continued, his voice growing more strained. "I remember walking for what felt like hours, trying to find the right trail. And then I started hearing voices." "The same voices we heard at the campsite?" Andres asked. "I don't know. Maybe. But these sounded different, more organized." Carlos told us he'd tried to hide when he heard the voices approaching, but he'd been found by a group of men. "There were 4 or 5 of them," he said, "all dressed in camouflage, all armed. They surrounded me before I could run." "What did they want?" I asked. "That's the thing," Carlos said, rubbing his temples as if he had a terrible headache. "I can't remember. I remember them finding me. I remember them talking to me, but I can't remember what they said. It's like there's a blank spot in my memory." The next thing Carlos clearly remembered was waking up that morning in a hospital bed, being told by nurses that he'd been found by hikers near a main trail, about 10 kilometers from where he'd disappeared. "The doctors say it could be traumatic amnesia," he explained, "that my mind is blocking memories of something that was too stressful to process." "But 5 days?" Miguel said. "You don't remember anything from 5 whole days?" Carlos shook his head slowly. "Fragments, images that might be dreams or might be real memories, being in some kind of shelter or cabin, voices talking about me like I wasn't there, but nothing coherent, nothing that makes sense." The hospital doctors confirmed that Carlos had been well cared for during his disappearance. Though he was dehydrated and had lost weight, he showed no signs of severe physical abuse. His injuries were consistent with being lost in the forest for several days. Minor cuts from branches, insect bites, and bruises from falls. "What's unusual," the doctor told us, "is the specific nature of his memory loss. Traumatic amnesia typically affects memories around the traumatic event, but preserves basic orientation and the ability to form new memories. Your friend seems to have lost 5 specific days entirely." Over the next few weeks, as Carlos recovered at home, small fragments of memory began to return, but they were disturbing and didn't provide a clear picture of what had happened. "I remember being in some kind of structure," he told us during one of our visits. "It wasn't a normal house, more like a shelter or bunker. There were multiple rooms, but no windows, and there were other people there, but I can't remember their faces." "Did they hurt you?" Miguel asked. "I don't think so," Carlos said, but he sounded uncertain. I remember being given food and water, but I also remember being scared, like I was being held against my will. The most disturbing memories Carlos recovered were about conversations he'd overheard but hadn't fully understood. They talked about me like I was, like I was a problem that needed to be solved, he told us. They mentioned numbers, maybe coordinates, and they talked about cleaning something. But every time I try to focus on remembering more details, it's like my mind shuts down. The psychologists we consulted suggested that Carlos might have witnessed some kind of criminal activity, and his mind was blocking the memories as a protective mechanism. Sometimes, when we experience something that our brain interprets as a survival threat, one of the specialists explained, the mind can essentially file away those memories in a way that makes them inaccessible to conscious recall. The police investigation into Carlos's disappearance continued for months, but never produced concrete results. The armed men we'd seen were never identified or caught. The forest area was searched multiple times, but no evidence of ongoing criminal activity was found. It's possible they were smugglers or traffickers using the forest as a transport route, the sergeant who'd led the initial search speculated. Groups like that typically move quickly and leave no evidence behind. But why would they have held Carlos for 5 days? I asked. He might have witnessed something they didn't want reported immediately, keeping him until they could finish their operations and move to a new area. And the memory loss? The sergeant shrugged. Could be natural, or it could have been induced. There are substances that can cause temporary memory loss. Without blood tests from the time of his release, it's impossible to know for sure. Over the following months, our group of friends struggled with the aftermath of the experience. Carlos, understandably, developed severe anxiety about being in open or isolated spaces. Miguel became obsessive about safety planning, researching every destination extensively before being willing to visit it. Andres blamed himself for choosing that campsite location and for losing sight of Carlos on the trail, and I found myself unable to enjoy nature the way I used to. Every outdoor trip was colored by paranoia and hypervigilance. Sounds that once had been soothing now made me nervous. The feeling of being in remote places, which had once been liberating, now felt dangerous. I think we need to accept that our camping days are over, Miguel said during a meeting 6 months after the incident. At least for a while, we all agreed. The experience had fundamentally changed our relationship with outdoor activities and remote spaces. Carlos continued seeing therapists and memory specialists for over a year after his disappearance. Gradually, he recovered more fragments of memory, but never a complete picture of what had happened during those 5 days. It's frustrating, he told us during one of our regular support meetups. I know something significant happened, something that changed my life, but I can't access those memories. It's like having a book with pages torn out. The fragments he did recover painted a disturbing but incomplete picture. He remembered being in multiple different locations during his disappearance, suggesting he'd been moved several times. He remembered voices discussing whether it was safe to release him. And most disturbingly, he remembered the sense that he wasn't the first person to have been held by this group. There was evidence other people had been in those same rooms, he told us. Marks on the walls, personal items left behind, like they had an established system for dealing with unwanted witnesses. About a year after the incident, Carlos finally made the decision to undergo regressive hypnosis, despite warnings from several of his doctors about the potential risks of recovering repressed traumatic memories. I need to know, he told us. Living with these fragments, with this constant sense that there's something important I can't remember, is worse than facing whatever truth might be buried there. The hypnosis session was conducted by a specialist recommended by the hospital, with us present as emotional support. What emerged was partial but deeply disturbing. Under hypnosis, Carlos recalled being captured by the group of armed men almost immediately after separating from us on the trail. He tried to run, but was quickly overpowered. They took me to some kind of temporary compound, Carlos recalled, while under hypnosis. It wasn't a permanent structure, more like a series of connected shelters. There were other men there, maybe 8 or 10 in total. Carlos remembered being questioned extensively about who we were, what we'd seen, whether we'd reported our travel plans to anyone. The men seemed particularly concerned about whether we'd taken photos or recorded GPS coordinates. They were running something in that forest, Carlos recalled. Not drugs exactly, but some kind of smuggling operation. They mentioned routes across the border, coordination schedules, contacts in different cities. The most disturbing of Carlos's recovered memories was the revelation that he'd been held alongside 2 other people, a hiker who had apparently stumbled across the operation several weeks earlier, and a woman who seemed to have been there for months. The hiker was in bad shape, Carlos recalled, like he'd been there for a long time. And the woman, she acted like she'd lost all hope of being released. According to Carlos's memories, the group had been debating what to do with their witnesses for several days. Some wanted to eliminate the problem permanently, while others argued that multiple disappearances would draw too much police attention. They eventually decided it was safer to drug me and release me far from their operation, Carlos recalled. They gave me something that made me sleep, and the next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital. What happened to the other people? The hypnotherapist asked. Carlos's response chilled us to the bone. I don't know, but I heard some of the men talking about cleaning house before moving to a new location. After the hypnosis session, we immediately took the new information to the police. They conducted renewed searches of the area, including searches for bodies, but never found evidence of the other victims Carlos had described. It's possible his memories under hypnosis incorporated elements of dreams or subconscious anxieties, the detective warned us. Hypnosis can be a useful tool, but recovered memories aren't always entirely accurate. But both Carlos and we were convinced he'd recalled real events. The details were too specific, too consistent, to be merely products of his imagination. The police investigation continued intermittently for another year, but never produced arrests or resolution. The forest where it all happened had returned to its apparent tranquility, with no signs of the criminal activity we'd encountered. Groups like these typically operate for short periods in any one location, the detective explained during our last official meeting. By the time we have enough evidence to mount a serious investigation, they've usually already moved on. It's been 2 years since our last camping adventure, and all 4 of our lives have changed significantly as a result of the experience. Carlos eventually returned to work and a relatively normal life, but he still struggles with anxiety and occasional flashbacks to memory fragments. He's become an advocate for outdoor safety awareness and occasionally speaks at groups about his experience. What I learned, he told us recently, is that there are aspects of the world we'd rather not acknowledge. Criminal activities happening in places we think are safe. And sometimes, just being in the wrong place at the wrong time can change your life forever. Miguel now works in corporate security, using his traumatic experience as motivation to help protect others. Andres has become obsessive about research and planning, checking every detail before engaging in any activity that involves risk. And I find myself looking at forests differently now, What were once places of beauty and tranquility, I now see as spaces where terrible things can happen without witnesses, where people can disappear without a trace, where criminal activities can unfold entirely out of reach of civilization. Occasionally, one of us suggests that maybe we should try camping again, perhaps in a more populated area, closer to civilization. But every time we seriously consider the idea, we remember those 5 days when one of us simply vanished and the proposal quietly fades away. Maybe someday, Carlos says when the topic comes up, but not yet. There are still too many unanswered questions, too many memories I can't fully reach. The truth is, we've all come to accept that we'll never fully know what happened during those 5 days. The memories Carlos has recovered provide a disturbing framework, but they're filled with gaps and uncertainties. What we do know is that we stumbled across something we weren't supposed to see, something serious enough that armed and organized people considered holding or eliminating witnesses. And while Carlos was eventually released, the circumstances of his release and the associated memory loss suggest his survival may have depended as much on luck as on any compassion from his captors. The experience taught us that the world holds more danger than we had imagined, especially in places we perceive as safe and natural. It also taught us about the fragility of memory and how traumatic events can be literally erased from consciousness as a survival mechanism. But perhaps most importantly, it taught us about the importance of friendship and support during crises. The way we came together to help Carlos through his recovery, the way each of us processed the trauma differently, but with mutual support, showed that even the most terrible experiences can be survived when you're not alone. Today, when Carlos tells his story, he always ends with the same reflection. I don't know exactly what happened to me during those 5 days. The memories I have might be entirely accurate, or they might be distorted by trauma and time. But I know that for whatever reason, luck, compassion, or just being more trouble than I was worth, I was returned to my life and my friends. And that's enough. His friend recounts that they were followed through the forest by a group of men, and then he doesn't remember what happened, only when they found him 5 days later in a hospital and nothing else. The memories in between remain largely erased, perhaps protecting him from truths his mind decided were better forgotten. That's our story, and that's why we no longer go camping together. Some fears, once awakened, never fully go back to sleep. The day of the camp had started like any other summer day for a 12-year-old girl. It was July of 1998, and I was attending a summer camp organized by my school in the forests near Cuenca. My name is Kayla, and though more than 25 years have passed since that day, the memories of what I found in that cave are still as vivid as if it happened yesterday. It was my second year at the camp, and I felt more independent and adventurous than the previous time. At 12, I was at that age where I wanted to prove I was no longer a little kid, but I still had that insatiable curiosity that can lead children into situations they don't fully understand. The camp was set in a valley surrounded by wooded mountains, a perfect place for outdoor activities. There were about 40 children of different ages, from 8 to 14 years old, supervised by 8 counselors and 2 directors. The facilities were basic but adequate: wooden cabins for sleeping, a communal dining hall, cold showers that everyone avoided using, and an infirmary where Mrs. Carmen treated scraped knees and mosquito bites. During the first few days, I participated in all the scheduled activities: morning hikes, afternoon craft workshops, nighttime games around the campfire. But what I loved most was exploring. The forest surrounding the camp seemed endless, filled with winding trails, crystal clear streams, and rock formations that sparked my imagination. The counselors had set clear boundaries about how far we could stray from the camp. There was a green zone where we could go alone, a yellow zone where we needed to be in groups of at least 3, and a red zone that was completely off limits. The red zone included the more mountainous and remote areas, which we were told were dangerous and easy to get lost in. Naturally, the red zone was the one that attracted me the most. It was our 5th day at camp when I met Pablo, a 13-year-old boy who had arrived late due to a family illness. Pablo was from Madrid, like me, but from a different neighborhood. He was slim, with dark, always messy hair, and had a quiet confidence that impressed me. From the moment he arrived, he managed to subtly skirt many of the camp's rules without getting caught. "Want to see something really cool?" Pablo asked me during the mandatory nap time on the 3rd day after his arrival. We were lying in our bunks, supposedly resting after lunch, but I was wide awake, staring at the wooden ceiling and listening to the sounds of the forest outside. "What?" I whispered back. "There are caves in the mountains. Real caves, not just little holes in the rocks. My older brother came to this camp 3 years ago and told me about them." "That's in the red zone," I said, though I could feel my pulse quickening at the idea. "Exactly," Pablo grinned. "That's why it'll be a real adventure." We spent the rest of that day and the next planning our secret expedition. Pablo had somehow gotten hold of a basic topographic map, he never told me how, and had marked what he thought was the general location of the caves based on his brother's descriptions. "It'll be easy," he assured me. We wait until after dinner, when everyone's at the campfire. We sneak out, walk for an hour, explore one of the caves, and get back before bedtime roll call. I knew it was a terrible idea. I knew that if we got caught, we'd be sent home immediately, and our parents would be furious. But at 12, the allure of doing something forbidden and adventurous was irresistible. The chosen night was a Thursday. After dinner, while the other kids gathered around the campfire for ghost stories told by Carlos, one of the younger counselors, Pablo and I managed to slip out of our cabins. I had packed my flashlight, a water bottle, and some granola bars in my small backpack. Pablo had the map, his own flashlight, and a Swiss Army knife he'd brought from home without the counselors noticing during the luggage check. The initial plan was to hike for an hour toward the mountains, find one of the caves, explore briefly, and then return. We estimated the whole trip would take about 3 hours, giving us enough time to get back before curfew. The first 40 minutes of hiking were relatively easy. We followed marked trails heading toward the higher elevations, lighting our way with flashlights kept on low settings to avoid drawing attention. The nighttime forest was different from the daytime one, more mysterious, filled with sounds I couldn't identify, but not particularly frightening. It was thrilling to feel like real explorers. Things got more challenging when we left the marked trails. The terrain became steeper and rockier, and we had to use our flashlights more often to navigate through dense trees and rock formations. Pablo consulted the map constantly, but in the dark, it was hard to orient ourselves using landscape features. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" I asked, after tripping over an exposed route for the 3rd time. "Pretty sure," he replied, though I could detect a note of uncertainty in his voice. "The caves should be just beyond that rocky ridge." We kept climbing for another 20 minutes. The air was getting colder, and I could hear the sound of running water somewhere nearby. Finally, we reached an area where the rock formations became more prominent, with large outcrops rising dramatically from the forest floor. "There," Pablo said, pointing his flashlight at a dark shadow at the base of a large rocky cliff. "That has to be one of the caves." We approached cautiously, using our flashlights to examine the entrance. It was definitely a real cave, not just a shallow crack in the rock. The opening was about 2 meters high and 1.5 meters wide, large enough for us to pass through easily, but not so large that it felt open and airy. "Should we go in?" Pablo asked, and I could hear a mix of excitement and nervousness in his voice. "We've come this far," I said, though my own stomach was churning with apprehension. "But just a quick look." Pablo went in first, shining his flashlight into the cave. I followed, keeping my own flashlight on and one hand on the rocky wall for balance. The first few meters of the cave were relatively straight and spacious. The floor was mostly flat, covered with a layer of dry dirt and small rocks. The walls showed the characteristic marks of water that had flowed there for thousands of years, creating smooth, rounded shapes in the limestone. "This is amazing," Pablo whispered, shining his light at the ceiling, which arched about 3 meters above our heads. We had gone about 10 meters inside when the cave took a left turn. Pablo rounded the corner first, and I heard his sharp intake of breath. "Keela," he said, his voice sounding strange. "You need to see this." I rounded the corner and shone my flashlight where Pablo was looking. What we saw made my stomach drop and my heart start pounding violently. On the cave floor, scattered in what was clearly a deliberate arrangement, were bones. Lots of bones. And they weren't animal bones. There were several human skulls, clearly visible even in the dim light of our flashlights. They were arranged in a sort of circle, surrounded by what looked like long bones, femurs, tibias, humeri. Some of the bones were bleached by time. Others still had tissue clinging to them, suggesting some were more recent than others. "My God," I whispered, feeling like I was going to vomit. "What is this?" Pablo slowly moved his flashlight around the area, revealing more horrifying details. There was clothing scattered among the bones, scraps of fabric that might have been t-shirts, shoes of different sizes, even what looked like a small backpack, similar to the ones camp kids used. "We have to go," I said, my voice trembling. "We have to go now." But Pablo seemed morbidly fascinated. He kept moving his flashlight, examining the macabre scene. "Pablo," I said louder, "we have to go." "Wait," he said. "Look at this." He shone his light on a cave wall where someone had carved marks. They weren't random scratches. They seemed deliberate, maybe even a form of writing or symbols. There were also what looked like dates etched into the rock, though they were hard to read clearly in the flashlight's beam. 1987, 1991, 1995, Pablo read slowly. "Keela, I think someone's been bringing people here for years." The realization of what we were seeing, that this wasn't an ancient burial site, but apparently a place where someone had been bringing victims for over a decade, filled me with a terror I had never experienced before. "Pablo, we're leaving now," I said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the cave's exit. He finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. We hurried toward the cave's entrance as fast as we could safely move, our flashlights casting dancing shadows on the walls as we ran. Once outside the cave, we didn't stop. We ran downhill through the forest, jumping over fallen logs and slipping on wet leaves, desperate to put distance between us and what we'd found. It wasn't until we were back in familiar territory, near the marked trails leading to the camp, that we finally stopped to catch our breath. "What do we do?" I gasped, my hands shaking as I tried to drink from my water bottle. "I don't know," Pablo said, and for the first time since I'd met him, he seemed genuinely scared. Do we tell the counselors? How do we explain being up there? They'll send us home. But Keela, there were dead people up there. Lots of dead people. And some of them looked recent. He was right, of course. No matter the consequences for us, what we'd found was too serious to keep secret. We got back to the camp just as the counselors were doing the final nighttime rounds before curfew. We managed to slip into our cabins without being detected, but neither of us slept that night. The next morning, during breakfast, Pablo and I managed to talk privately. I have to tell someone, I said. I can't live knowing what we saw and not doing anything about it. But what if we get in trouble? Pablo, there were dead kids up there. Some of those bones were from kids. I saw shoes the right size, clothes that could have belonged to people our age. That realization shook him as much as it did me. The possibility that some of the victims were children made the whole situation even more horrific. We decided to tell Mrs. Carmen, the camp nurse. She was the most approachable adult, and we hoped she'd be sympathetic to our dilemma. We found her in the infirmary during the morning rest period, organizing medical supplies. Mrs. Carmen, I said, my voice shaking despite my efforts to keep it steady. We need to tell you something important. She could tell immediately from our expressions that it was serious. What's wrong, kids? We told her the whole story, our plan to explore the caves, the nighttime hike, and what we'd found. I described the bones, the skulls, the clothing, the dates carved into the wall. Pablo added details about the arrangement of the remains and his impression that some were more recent than others. Mrs. Carmen listened in silence, her expression growing more serious with every detail. When we finished, she stayed quiet for several minutes. Are you absolutely sure of what you saw? She asked finally. Yes, we both said immediately. Could you find the cave again? Pablo nodded. I think so. I remember the way, and I marked some trees in my head. Mrs. Carmen stood up and closed the infirmary door. Listen to me very carefully, she said. What you've told me is extremely serious. If it's true, we need to involve the authorities immediately. But I also need you to understand that you're going to be in significant trouble for breaking the camp's rules. We understand, I said, but it was too important to keep quiet. You did the right thing by telling me, she said. But now I need you to go to your morning activities and act normally while I figure out how to handle this. Don't tell anyone else what you saw. Understood? We spent the rest of the morning trying to participate in the scheduled activities, but it was impossible to focus. During the craft workshop, my hands shook so much I couldn't hold the scissors properly. During the swimming period at the lake, I stayed on the shore, watching the other kids play and laugh, wondering how they could be so happy and carefree when I knew something so terrible existed in the mountains above. It was during lunch that Mrs. Carmen approached our table. Pablo, Keela, she said discreetly, I need you to come with me after you eat. She took us to the camp's administrative office, where two men in suits I didn't recognize were waiting. One was tall and thin, with the gray hair, the other shorter and stockier, with a neatly trimmed beard. These are Detective Martinez and Detective Lopez from the Guardia Civil, Mrs. Carmen explained. I've told them what you told me this morning, and they want to hear the story directly from you. For the next hour, we repeated our story several times, with the detectives asking increasingly specific questions about what we'd seen. They wanted to know the exact number of skulls, where they were located, what kind of clothing we'd seen, if we'd noticed any unusual smells, if we'd touched anything. Can you show us where the cave is? Detective Martinez asked. Pablo nodded. I think so. I remember the way pretty well. Good. We're going to organize an expedition this afternoon. You'll show us the location, then you'll be escorted back to the camp while we examine the site. That afternoon, Pablo and I led a team of 6 Guardia Civil officers back to the mountains. The trip was very different in daylight, easier to navigate, but also more real somehow. In the daylight, I couldn't convince myself we'd imagined it all. When we reached the area where the cave was located, I could see Pablo had been right about recognizing the way. We found the correct rock formation almost immediately. "That's it," I said, pointing to the dark opening we'd explored the night before. The officers had us wait about 50 meters away while they examined the cave's entrance. After several minutes, Detective Martinez came back to us. "You did the right thing reporting this," he said, his expression grim. "Now, I need you to head back to the camp with Officer Ruiz. We don't want you seeing any more than you already have." During the trip back to the camp, Officer Ruiz asked us more questions about exactly how we'd found the cave and whether we'd noticed anything else unusual in the area. He also asked if we'd seen anyone else in the forest during our nighttime exploration. "Are you going to arrest someone?" Pablo asked. "That depends on what we find," Officer Ruiz said. "But I want you to understand that this is going to be a very serious investigation. You're going to have to talk to more detectives, and your parents are going to be contacted." That night, after dinner, all the camp kids were gathered in the main dining hall. The camp director, Mr. Alvarez, told us that due to unforeseen circumstances, the camp was being ended early. Our parents would be contacted to pick us up the next day. Naturally, this caused panic and confusion among the other kids. Rumors spread about everything from disease outbreaks to bear attacks. Pablo and I didn't say anything about our role in the events, but it was hard to keep our composure while listening to the increasingly wild speculation. My parents arrived early the next morning, clearly worried and confused about why the camp had been cancelled so suddenly. It wasn't until we were in the car, heading back to Madrid, that they told me the little they knew. "The officers told us that you and another child found something in the forest that required police investigation," my father said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Can you tell us what happened?" I told them the whole story, starting with my friendship with Pablo and our plan to explore the forbidden caves. I described what we'd found in the cave and how we'd reported our discovery to Mrs. Carmen. My parents listened in silence, their expressions growing more serious with every detail. "Keela," my mother said finally, "do you realize how dangerous what you did was? If someone had been near that cave, if whoever was responsible for what you found had been in the area." I hadn't considered that possibility during our nighttime adventure, but now that she mentioned it, I realized how close we'd come to real danger. Whoever was responsible for the deaths in the cave might have been nearby. They might have seen us. Over the next few weeks, I had to give statements to several different detectives. They had me draw maps of the cave, describe everything I remembered about the arrangement of the bones, and repeat my story multiple times to ensure consistency. They also had me speak with a child psychologist who helped me process what I'd seen. She explained that it was normal to feel fear, guilt, and confusion after encountering something so disturbing. "You didn't do anything wrong," she told me repeatedly. "You found something terrible, but you did exactly the right thing by reporting it to adults." Through these conversations, I learned some additional details about what the investigators had found in the cave. They confirmed there were remains of at least 12 different people, ranging in age from children to elderly adults. Some of the remains had been there for years, others were more recent. The dates carved into the cave wall roughly corresponded with dates when people had been reported missing in the region over the past 15 years. The investigators believed someone had been using the cave as a disposal site for over a decade. Did they catch the person who did it? I asked during one of my sessions with the psychologist. The detectives are working very hard on the investigation, she told me, but sometimes these cases take a long time to solve. That was one of the most frustrating parts of the whole experience. Despite finding such extensive evidence of multiple crimes, it seemed that identifying the perpetrator was going to be extremely difficult. Pablo and I kept in touch over the next few weeks through occasional phone calls. He was having similar experiences with detectives and psychologists, and like me, he was struggling to process what we'd seen. "Do you ever regret going into that cave?" he asked me during one of our conversations. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But then I remember that if we hadn't, no one would have ever known about those people. Their families would never have known what happened to them." That was true. During my sessions with the psychologist, I'd learned that several of the remains found in the cave had been identified as people who had been missing for years. The discovery was providing closure to families who had been searching for their loved ones for a long time. However, as the months passed, it became clear that the investigation wasn't progressing as quickly as everyone had hoped. The detectives had thoroughly examined the cave, interviewed local residents, and reviewed missing persons cases going back decades, but they hadn't been able to identify a specific suspect. One theory was that the perpetrator had died or moved away from the area, which would explain why there were no more recent remains in the cave. Another possibility was that they were well hidden within the local community, perhaps someone who knew the forest intimately and could move victims to the cave without being detected. During the fall after the camp, my parents decided I needed to talk to another psychologist, one who specialized in helping children who had witnessed trauma. Dr. Sanchez was a kind, older man with an office full of books and plants. "How do you feel about having found the cave?" he asked me during one of our first sessions. "Confused," I said. "Sometimes I feel good because we help those families know what happened to their loved ones, but other times I feel scared because we know there's someone out there who did those terrible things and they've never been caught." "Those are very understandable feelings," he told me. "Have you had nightmares about what you saw?" I'd had nightmares, though not always directly about the cave. Often, I dreamed about being lost in dark forests or finding things I wasn't supposed to find. Sometimes I dreamed someone was following me, though I could never see who it was. Dr. Sanchez taught me techniques for coping with anxiety and nightmares. He also helped me understand that while what I'd seen was terrible, it wasn't my responsibility to solve the case or find the perpetrator. "Your job," he told me, "was to report what you found." And that's exactly what you did. Professional detectives will handle the rest. During the winter, the story started appearing occasionally in the news. Newspapers covered it as the mystery of the Bone Cave, though reporters were careful not to mention our names specifically since we were minors. Reading about the case in the papers was surreal. Reporters described the same bones I'd seen, the same cave I'd been in, but in a way that felt distant and almost fictional. It was hard to reconcile these clinical accounts with my own vivid memories of terror and horror. The articles mentioned that the investigation was ongoing, but it was clear the detectives didn't have solid leads. They had established that the victims had been killed over a period of about 15 years, but they hadn't been able to identify connections between the victims or a clear modus operandi. One theory that emerged was that the perpetrator might have been someone associated with the camp area or with outdoor recreational activities in the region. Many of the victims had been hikers, campers, or people who had come to the area for outdoor activities. This made me think about all the adults I'd met during my years at summer camps. Could the killer have been among them? Could I have met the monster responsible for what I saw in the cave? During the following spring, the detectives contacted me again. They wanted to ask me some additional questions, specifically about whether I'd noticed anything unusual about any of the adults at the camp during the days before our discovery. Was there anyone who acted strangely? Detective Martinez asked. Anyone who seemed particularly interested in the kids' activities, or who asked questions about where the kids went during free time? I thought carefully, going over my memories of that week at camp. Most of the counselors and directors had been people I knew from previous camps, and I hadn't noticed anything particularly unusual about their behavior. But then I remembered something that had seemed odd at the time, but hadn't felt significant until now. There was a man who wasn't part of the regular staff, I said. He came during our second night, said he was from the company that supplied some of our food provisions, but he stayed for the rest of the week, and he seemed to always be around when the kids were doing activities. Do you remember his name? I think it was Ricardo, Roberto, something like that. He was middle-aged, brown hair, not particularly tall or short, but it seemed weird to me that someone from a supply company would stay for so long. The detective took extensive notes on this information and asked if I could recall any other details about this man. Had he talked to specific kids? Had he asked questions about the camp's activities? Had he shown particular interest in the rules about where kids could go? Now that I think about it, I said, he did ask some questions about the camp's boundaries. He asked about how far the kids were allowed to wander and if there were ever issues with kids getting lost. And how did the camp staff respond? I think Mr. Alvarez told him about the color zones and mentioned that occasionally kids tried to go farther than allowed, but they had procedures for dealing with that. This information seemed to interest the detectives significantly. They asked me more questions about the man, but I'd already shared everything I could remember. Over the next few months, I waited to hear that they'd arrested someone in connection with the case. But the updates became less frequent, and I gradually realized the investigation had stalled. The man I'd remembered, the supply company worker, had been investigated but turned out to have a solid alibi for several of the dates when people had gone missing. The detectives followed other leads, but none led to an arrest. When I started high school, I tried to put the whole experience behind me. It had been over a year since the discovery, and though the nightmares had lessened, I still found myself thinking about the cave at unexpected moments. During history classes, when we studied ancient civilizations and burial sites, during science classes, when we learned about decomposition and forensic archaeology. Pablo and I gradually lost touch as our lives took different directions. He transferred to a private school, and I threw myself into my studies and extracurricular activities, trying to build a normal life. In the summer of 2003, when I was 17, I got an unexpected call from Detective Martinez. "Keela," he said, "could you come to the station? There's something I need to show you." My stomach dropped immediately. For the past few years, I'd assumed the case would never be solved, that whoever was responsible had gotten away with it. At the station, Detective Martinez showed me a photograph of a middle-aged man with gray hair and cold eyes that felt unsettlingly familiar. "Do you recognize this man?" he asked. I studied the photograph carefully. There was something about the eyes, the shape of the jaw. I think he might be the man from the camp, I said slowly. The one who said he was from the supply company. But he looks older, and his hair was darker then. His name is Roberto Mendoza, the detective said. He was arrested yesterday in Salamanca in connection with the disappearance of 2 hikers last month. He told me that Roberto had been identified by witnesses near the area where the hikers had gone missing. When they searched his home, they found detailed maps of several mountainous regions, including the area around the camp where we'd found the cave. They also found a diary. In the diary, the detective explained, he describes multiple murders over a period of 15 years. He specifically mentions the cave you found and describes how he transported victims there. The room started to spin. After all these years, they'd finally found the monster. He also mentions the camp, the detective continued. He describes how he regularly visited camps and recreational areas to scout potential victims. His last entry before abandoning the cave was in July of 1998. July of 1998, the month we'd been at the camp. Do you think he knew we'd found the cave? I asked. It's possible. His diary suggests he abandoned the cave because he feared it had been discovered. He likely learned that the camp had been cancelled suddenly and guessed why. Over the next few weeks, Roberto Mendoza confessed fully. He admitted to killing 17 people over a period of 15 years, using the cave as his primary disposal site. His method was to approach lone hikers, campers, or children who had strayed from supervised groups. He'd lure them with offers of help or information about trails, then take them to remote areas where he'd kill them. The cave had been perfect for his purposes, remote, hard to find, and large enough to store multiple victims. He'd been using it for so long that he'd started to think of it as his private collection. In his confession, he admitted he'd been watching our camp for several days before our discovery. He'd been waiting for an opportunity to isolate one of the children, but the right opportunity hadn't come up. When the camp was cancelled suddenly, he knew immediately something had gone wrong. He'd returned to the cave that same night to find it surrounded by police tape. Roberto Mendoza's trial was widely covered by the media. Pablo and I testified about our discovery of the cave, describing once again what we'd seen that July night 5 years earlier. Seeing Roberto in person, sitting in the defendant's box, was deeply unsettling. He was smaller than I remembered, more ordinary. He seemed exactly the kind of person you might overlook in a crowd, which had made him so effective as a predator. During his testimony, he described his crimes with a coldness that made me feel sick. He talked about his victims as if they were objects, describing how he'd planned each murder and how he'd arranged the bodies in the cave. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's been more than 25 years since that night in the forest, and though I finally have answers about what Pablo and I found, the experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I became a social worker, specializing in helping families of missing persons. Part of my motivation came from remembering the families who finally got answers about their loved ones because of our discovery. Pablo became a criminal detective. He says that night in the cave showed him how important it was for someone to stand up for victims who could no longer stand up for themselves. We both carry the scars of what we saw, but we also carry the knowledge that doing the right thing, even when it's terrifying, can make a real difference in the world. I still have nightmares about the cave sometimes. In my dreams, I'm back there, 12 years old, shining my flashlight on those scattered bones. But now, instead of pure terror, I also feel something else. The satisfaction of knowing we helped bring closure to 17 families and that Roberto Mendoza will never hurt another person again. The cave was permanently sealed after the trial, but its secret had already been revealed, and justice, though delayed, finally came for all the victims who rested in its darkness. Hello everyone, I'm Renato, now living in a small apartment in Seattle, Washington, where the constant rain taps against the windows like restless fingers, and the air smells of wet pine and freshly brewed coffee. I'm 35 years old, working as a park ranger in Olympic National Park, patrolling trails where the silence is broken only by the crunch of branches and the songs of birds. But 10 years ago, when I was 25, my life was different. I lived in a shared house in Portland, Oregon, working as a mechanic in an auto shop where the smell of oil and burnt rubber clung to my skin like a second layer. I was a regular guy, or so I thought, with a passion for hiking that took me to the woods every weekend, seeking peace among the tall trees and soft ground covered with dry leaves. That day, a Saturday in the fall of 2015, changed everything. The day I entered the forest, expecting a relaxing hike, and came out with a horror that still keeps me awake at night. Sit down, because this isn't just a story. It's a chilling memory that makes me question whether I'll ever be able to walk a trail alone without feeling something lurking among the trees. It all started that day, a gray Saturday in October, when the Portland sky looked like a heavy blanket of clouds that threatened rain but never fully let it fall. I woke up late, with the smell of stale coffee from the shared kitchen seeping under my door, and decided I needed fresh air. My week had been hell, double shifts at the shop, fixing engines that roared like wounded beasts, and an argument with my housemate over late rent. The forest was my escape, a place where the world shrank to the sound of leaves crunching under my boots and the wind whispering secrets among the branches. I chose Gifford Pinchot National Forest, about 2 hours drive away, a place I knew well for its twisting trails and rivers that ran like silver veins through the green earth. I packed my backpack with water, a turkey sandwich I quickly made on the stained kitchen counter, a crumpled map I kept in a drawer, and my old Canon digital camera, which I used to capture photos of landscapes that I later hung on my wall to remind me there was something beyond oil and metal. The drive was calm, the radio tuned to a classic rock station playing Led Zeppelin songs, the air coming through the open window smelling of damp earth and fresh pine. I reached the trailhead parking lot around 11, the place nearly empty except for a couple of rusty cars that looked abandoned. I put on my boots, adjusted my backpack straps, and started walking down the main trail, the soft ground absorbing my steps like an old mattress. The forest was a living world, with tall trees leaning in like ancient guardians, their yellow and red leaves falling like confetti at a silent funeral. The air was crisp, heavy with the scent of moss and fertile earth, and the sound of a distant river murmured like a shared secret. I walked for hours, losing myself in the rhythm of my steps, the crunch of branches under my boots, and the occasional flutter of a bird breaking the silence with a quick flap of wings. I veered off the main trail, following a less traveled path that promised wilder views, the kind of place where you feel like the first person to step there in years. The sun filtered through the canopy, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced on the ground like playful spirits. But there's nothing paranormal here, just nature in its rawest form. It was around 3 in the afternoon when the forest grew denser, the trees closing in like living walls, and the air cooler, almost cold, with a damp smell that made me adjust my jacket. I was thinking about turning back when I saw something that didn't belong. A wooden structure half hidden among the trees. A small, dilapidated cabin with rotting boards and a moss-covered roof that looked ready to collapse. I approached with curiosity, my heart beating a little faster, not from fear, but from the thrill of an unexpected discovery in a place that felt forgotten by time. The cabin was a relic, with broken windows covered with dirty plastic and a door hanging on rusty hinges. The smell of rotting wood and something else, something metallic and stale, seeped from inside, and the silence around it was oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I pushed the door open carefully, the creak echoing like a scream in the void, and stepped inside, my phone's flashlight illuminating the dark interior. The place looked empty at first glance. A dirt floor covered with dry leaves, walls with faded graffiti saying things like J and M forever, scratched with a knife, and a tattered mattress in a corner that smelled of mold and neglect. But then I heard a sound, low and trembling, like a muffled sob, coming from a room at the back, separated by a dirty curtain hanging like dead skin. My heart raced, suspense building like an approaching wave, and I moved closer, pulling back the curtain with trembling hands. What I saw froze my blood. 2 children, no older than 8 and 10 years old, chained to the floor with rusty shackles that cut into their pale skin, filthy to the point that their clothes seemed part of the earth, and thin, with bones protruding under their skin like dry twigs. They were huddled together, their large, terrified eyes glinting in the light of my flashlight, the smell of urine and fear filling the small space like a toxic gas. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice a broken whisper, as horror hit me like a punch, my mind refusing to process the scene. The older child, a boy with matted hair and a torn shirt, looked at me with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. "Please, help us. He'll be back soon." His voice was a fragile thread, and the younger one, a girl with a face streaked with dried tears, sobbed, clinging to her brother as if he were her only anchor in a sea of terror. I didn't waste time. Fear for them overpowered any caution, and I searched the cabin for tools, finding a rusty hammer in a corner that I used to break the chains, each strike echoing like thunder in the forest silence, my hands sweating and trembling as the shackles gave way with a metallic crunch. The children were weak, their bodies shaking as they stood, and I helped them out, the forest's fresh air hitting us like a cold slap. I called 911 from my phone, the signal weak but enough, explaining the situation with a trembling voice while guiding the children down the trail, the sun setting and stretching shadows like fingers trying to grab us. The police arrived hours later, helicopters circling above the forest, and the children were taken to a hospital where abuse was confirmed. Old bruises, malnutrition, signs of torture that made me vomit in the police station bathroom. I filed a report, recounting every detail, and the man responsible, a fugitive wanted for kidnapping, was caught days later in a nearby cabin. But the horror didn't end there. The children told me, in whispers, how they'd been abducted months earlier and how the man kept them as pets. Today, years later, I still patrol forests, but every snapping branch reminds me of that cabin and the fear that there might be more like it lurking in the dark. I've always loved going camping. Ever since I was a child, I eagerly awaited those summer escapes into nature that my family religiously organized. My name is Eleanor, and though 15 years have passed since the events I'm about to share, there are still nights when I wake up drenched in cold sweat, reliving every second of that day that changed my life forever. It was July of 2009. I was 17 years old, and I had just finished my second to last year of high school. My parents, as they did every summer, had planned our traditional camping trip to the Picos de Europa. It was a family tradition we'd been following for as long as I could remember. Dad, Mom, my younger brother Marcos, who was then 14, and me. The Picos de Europa had always been our favorite destination. We knew the area like the back of our hands, or so we thought. We had camped in different spots over the years, but that summer, Dad decided it was time to explore a new area, deeper into the Western Massif, near the Covadonga Lakes. This year, we're going to do something different, he told us, as he spread topographic maps across the dining room table weeks before the trip. We're going deeper into the forest, away from the usual tourist routes. I remember being thrilled by the idea. At 17, I felt old enough to take on bigger challenges, and the prospect of exploring untouched territory seemed exciting. Marcos was also enthusiastic, though for different reasons. He just wanted to impress Dad by proving he wasn't a little kid anymore. We set off early on a Monday morning from Madrid. The car trip to Asturias was long but pleasant, filled with the usual family jokes and stops at rest areas to stretch our legs. Mom had packed sandwiches for the journey, and Marcos and I bickered over controlling the music as always. We arrived at the base camp near Covadonga late in the afternoon. Dad had chosen a semi-wild camping area, far from official campsites. It was a small clearing by a stream, surrounded by ancient beech and oak trees that formed a kind of natural cathedral. The place was absolutely beautiful, but there was something about the forest's silence that felt unsettling from the start. "Doesn't it seem too quiet?" I commented to Marcos as we set up our tents. "It's normal," he replied, though I could tell he'd noticed it too. "We're deep in the forest. There are no roads nearby." He was right, of course. We were several kilometers from any traveled path, in an area only reached by very experienced hikers. Dad had specifically chosen this spot because he wanted us to experience real nature, as he called it. That first night passed without incident. We ate dinner around a small campfire. Dad told us stories about his own youthful adventures, and we all went to bed early, exhausted from the journey and the day's excitement. It was on the second day that everything began. We had planned a full-day hike following a trail Dad had marked on the map. It was supposed to lead us to a natural lookout point with a view of the entire valley. It was a long hike, about 6 hours round trip, but we were all in good physical shape and had done similar routes before. We started early, right after breakfast. Dad led the way with the map and compass, followed by Mom, then Marcos, and I brought up the rear. It was our usual hiking order, designed to ensure no one got left behind. The first few kilometers were perfect. The trail, though narrow, was well marked, and the forest was spectacular. Sun rays filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced on the moss-covered ground. The air was fresh and clean, with that distinctive smell of damp earth and vegetation found only in deep forests. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours when we reached a fork that wasn't on Dad's map. "That's strange," he muttered, studying the map with a furrowed brow. "According to this, the trail should continue straight, but it clearly splits here." The two paths looked equally traveled. One veered left, climbing gently through fir trees, while the other went right, descending slightly into what seemed to be a deeper valley. "They're probably unofficial trails made by other hikers," Mom said. "Which one do we take?" Dad studied the compass and then the map again. "Based on the direction, we should take the left one," he decided finally. "It'll lead us toward where we want to go." We continued down the left trail, but after half an hour of walking, it became clear something was wrong. The trail grew less defined, and the vegetation denser. It felt like we were venturing into a part of the forest where very few people had been before. "Dad," I said, starting to feel a pang of worry, "are you sure we're on the right path?" He stopped and checked the map again, this time more thoroughly. "Honestly, I'm not sure," he admitted after several minutes. "This trail isn't on the map, but the direction seems right." That was the first time I saw uncertainty in my father's eyes during one of our expeditions. He had always been the perfect guide, the one who never got lost, the one who always knew exactly where we were and where we were going. "What do we do?" Marcus asked, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Let's keep going a bit longer," Dad decided. "If we don't find a clear landmark in half an hour, we'll turn back and head to the fork." But that half hour turned into an hour, and then another. The trail grew increasingly vague, sometimes disappearing entirely, forcing us to push through vegetation while hoping we were still heading in the right direction. It was about 3 hours into being lost that we hit our first serious problem. We were crossing what seemed to be a small clearing when Mom tripped over a hidden root and fell badly, twisting her right ankle. The cry of pain she let out echoed through the forest. "Maria!" Dad shouted, running to her side. We all gathered around Mom, who was sitting on the ground, clutching her ankle with both hands. Even through her hiking boot, we could see it swelling rapidly. "I can't put weight on it," she said through gritted teeth. "I think it's bad." Dad examined the ankle carefully. Though he had no formal medical training, he'd taken enough first aid courses to know Mom wouldn't be walking for a while. The situation had suddenly become critical. We were lost in a dense forest, far from any marked trail, and one of us was injured. To make matters worse, it was getting late. We'd set out early in the morning, but with all the detours and backtracking, it was already mid-afternoon. "Okay," Dad said, trying to stay calm. "We'll set up a makeshift camp here. Maria needs to rest her ankle, and I'll try to find the main trail. You're not going alone," Mom said immediately. "You're right. Elena will come with me. Marcus, you stay with your mother." "Why, Elena?" Marcus protested. "I'm older, I should go." "Elena has a better sense of direction," Dad explained, which was true. Since I was little, I'd always had a kind of internal compass that helped me avoid getting lost. "Marcus, I need you to look after your mom. You're the man of the house while I'm gone." That seemed to satisfy my brother, who always responded well when Dad appealed to his sense of responsibility. We set up an impromptu camp in the clearing. Dad and I left our large backpacks with Mom and Marcus, taking only the essentials: water, some food, a flashlight, and the first aid kit. The plan was to find the main trail, mark the route back, and return before nightfall. "Don't stray far from the clearing," Dad told Mom. "If we're not back in 3 hours, light a big fire. The smoke will help us find you." We began our search for the lost trail around 4 in the afternoon. Dad decided we'd do concentric circles around the clearing, starting with a small radius and gradually expanding until we found a familiar landmark. The first circles revealed nothing useful. The forest seemed endless in every direction, a uniform mass of trees, bushes, and small streams not shown on any map. It was as if we'd entered a part of the world completely forgotten by civilization. It was during our third circle, when we'd ventured quite far from the clearing, that we heard the voices. At first, I thought it was my imagination. We'd been in silence for hours, hearing only our own footsteps and the occasional bird, so when I heard distant human voices, my first instinct was to think I was imagining it. But Dad had heard them too. "Did you hear that?" he asked, stopping abruptly. Yes, I whispered. Voices. We stood completely still, holding our breath and straining our ears. There they were again. Male voices, still too far to make out words, but definitely human. Thank God, Dad muttered. They must be other hikers. They can help us get our bearings. We started walking toward the voices, trying to make as little noise as possible so as not to startle whoever was there. The voices grew clearer as we got closer, though we still couldn't make out the words. It was when we were about 50 meters away that Dad signaled for me to stop. Wait, he whispered. Something's not right. I'd noticed it too. There was something about the tone of the voices that didn't sound like a normal conversation among hikers. It sounded more aggressive, tense. Dad motioned for us to crouch and approach more cautiously. We began crawling through the bushes, using the trees as cover, trying to see what was happening without being spotted. What we saw when we finally got close enough for a clear view marked me for the rest of my life. In a small clearing, similar to the one where we'd left Mom and Marcos, there were 3 men. 2 were standing, the third was on the ground. At first, I thought the man on the ground was injured and the others were helping him. But then I saw the ropes. The man on the ground was tied up. His hands were bound behind his back, and his feet were tied too. He had something in his mouth, a gag made from what looked like a t-shirt. His eyes were open, and even from a distance, I could see the absolute terror in them. The 2 standing men didn't look like typical hikers. They were bigger, rougher, dressed in dark clothing, unsuitable for forest trekking. One of them was holding something that glinted in the sunlight, a knife. My blood ran cold when I realized what I was witnessing. This wasn't a rescue or a first aid situation. This was something far, far worse. Dad must have reached the same conclusion at the same moment, because I felt his hand grip my arm tightly, keeping me still. The 2 men were talking to each other, but we were too far to hear clearly what they were saying. The taller man, the one with the knife, crouched beside the victim and said something to him. The victim shook his head frantically. Then the tall man cut his arm. The victim's muffled scream, even through the gag, was audible from our position. I had to cover my mouth with my hands to keep from vomiting. "We have to go," Dad whispered in my ear, his voice barely audible. "Right now." But I was paralyzed by horror. I couldn't tear my eyes away from what was happening in the clearing. The man with the knife kept asking questions, and every time the victim shook his head or didn't respond quickly enough, he made another cut. "Eleanor," Dad's voice was more urgent now. "We have to move. If they see us..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. If those men spotted us, we'd be their next victims. We started backing away very slowly, inch by inch, trying not to make any noise that might alert the men. Every branch that snapped under our weight sounded like a gunshot in my ears. We'd backed away maybe 20 meters when the inevitable happened. I stepped on a dry branch hidden under the leaves. The snap echoed through the forest like thunder. Everything stopped in the clearing. The 2 men immediately looked up, staring in our direction. "What was that?" I heard one of them ask. "Go check it out," the other replied. I saw the shorter man start walking toward us, carefully scanning the bushes. Dad grabbed my hand, and we started running. We ran like I'd never run in my life, leaping over fallen logs, pushing through thick bushes, not caring about the noise we made. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between us and those men. Behind us, I could hear shouts. The men had seen us and were chasing us. "This way!" one of them yelled. "There are 2 of them!" Terror gave me energy I didn't know I had. I was running faster than Dad, even though he'd always been more athletic than me. Pure fear had turned me into something faster and more agile than I'd ever been. We ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. We jumped over streams, slid down steep slopes, and pushed through vegetation that seemed designed to slow us down. Finally, when I could no longer hear voices behind us, Dad signaled for me to stop. We collapsed behind a massive tree, panting so hard I was sure anyone within kilometers could hear us. My heart was pounding so fiercely it felt like it might burst out of my chest. "Do you think we lost them?" I whispered when I could finally speak. Dad was constantly looking over his shoulder, listening for any sign of pursuit. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we can't stay here. We have to get back to your mom and Marcos." That's when we realized our second major problem. In our desperate escape, we completely lost our bearings. We had no idea which direction the clearing with the rest of our family was in. "Which way did we come from?" I asked, looking around. All the trees looked the same. Every direction seemed identical. Dad pulled out the compass, but his hands were shaking so much it took him several tries to read it correctly. I think the clearing is that way," he said, pointing toward what he hoped was northwest. "But I'm not sure." We had no choice. We started walking in the direction Dad indicated, moving much more slowly now, trying to make as little noise as possible, and stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. The forest had taken on an entirely different character after what we'd witnessed. Every shadow could have hidden a threat. Every sound, the wind in the leaves, the snap of a branch, a bird's call, made us jump. We walked for over an hour without finding anything familiar. The sun was starting to set, and soon we'd be navigating the forest in darkness. "Dad," I said finally, "what are we going to do if we don't find Mom and Marcos before it gets dark?" He stopped and looked at me. For the first time in my life, I saw real fear in my father's eyes. Not just worry or uncertainty, but genuine fear. "We'll find them," he said, but his voice didn't sound convincing. We kept walking as the forest gradually darkened around us. I was starting to consider the possibility that we'd never find my family, that we'd spend the night lost in the forest with killers lurking somewhere nearby. That's when we heard the most beautiful sound in the world, Marcos's voice shouting our names. "Dad! Elena! Where are you?" "Over here," Dad shouted back. "Keep yelling. We're coming to you." We followed Marcos's voice for several minutes until we finally saw the light of a campfire through the trees. I'd never been so happy to see anything in my life. Marcos and Mom were exactly where we'd left them. Mom was sitting by a campfire she'd clearly been keeping alive for hours, and Marcos was standing at the edge of the clearing, shouting our names. When they saw us emerge from the trees, Marcos ran toward us. "Where have you been? You've been gone for over 5 hours. I thought something terrible had happened. If only he knew," I thought. "We got lost," Dad said, which was technically true. "But we're okay now." Mom looked at us from the campfire. Her ankle was clearly causing her a lot of pain, but I could see the relief in her eyes. "Did you find the main trail?" she asked. Dad and I exchanged a glance. We'd discussed what to tell them during the walk back to the clearing. We decided that telling the truth about what we'd seen would only scare them unnecessarily and wouldn't change our immediate situation. "No," Dad said, "but tomorrow morning, we'll try again." That night was the longest of my life. Though I was physically exhausted, I couldn't sleep for a single minute. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the terrified face of the tied-up man, heard his muffled screams, saw the glint of the knife in his attacker's hand. Dad and I had decided to take turns keeping watch during the night, though we didn't tell Mom and Marcos why. We told them it was a normal precaution when camping in unfamiliar territory. During my watch, between 2 and 4 in the morning, I thought I heard distant voices several times. I was never sure if they were real or products of my terrified imagination, but each time I heard them, my heart started pounding violently, and I had to make a conscious effort not to wake the whole family. Dawn was a blessing. As soon as there was enough light to see, Dad and I began planning our strategy to get out of the forest. "We need to find running water," Dad said, studying the map again. "All the streams in this area eventually feed into the Dobra River. If we follow the river downstream, it'll lead us to a road." It was a sensible plan, but it meant we'd have to move Mom despite her injured ankle. We couldn't leave her alone with Marcos, not after what we'd seen the day before. We improvised a kind of crutch for Mom using a sturdy branch, and Dad took on most of her gear. Progress was slow and painful, but at least we were moving. We found a stream after about an hour of walking. It was small, but definitely flowing in a consistent direction. We decided to follow it, hoping it would eventually connect to something larger. Following the stream was easier than navigating through the dense forest, but it was still tough with Mom limping. Every few minutes, we had to stop so she could rest. It was during one of these stops that we heard voices again. This time, they were much closer and clearly coming our way. Dad looked at me with wide eyes. We both knew instantly that these weren't friendly hikers' voices. "What's wrong?" Mom asked, noticing our expressions. "Nothing," Dad lied. I think we should move a bit faster." But Mom wasn't fooled. She'd sensed something was off since the night before. "Carlos," she said, using Dad's full name as she did when she was serious. "What aren't you telling me?" The voices were getting closer. We no longer had time for explanations. "We need to hide," I said. "Now." "Hide from what?" Marcos asked, starting to get scared. Dad pointed to a dense cluster of bushes by the stream. "There." All of us. No questions. The authority in his voice was so strong that even Mom, despite her confusion, moved toward the bushes without arguing. We crouched in the bushes just in time. The voices were now close enough to be clearly audible. "They had to have come this way," I heard a rough voice say. "It's the only water source for kilometers." "Are you sure it was just 2? Another voice asked. "That's what I saw. An older man and a young girl." My blood ran cold. They were talking about us. "Well, now they're 4, the first voice said. "I saw their campfire smoke last night. They'd been watching us. All night, while we thought we were safe, they'd been out there, observing us." The men passed by our hiding spot, following the stream in the same direction we'd been heading. I could see their legs through the leaves as they passed. One was wearing military boots, the other had camouflage pants. We waited in the bushes for what felt like hours after their voices faded into the distance. No one moved, no one spoke. Marcos was trembling. Mom had an expression of absolute terror, and Dad seemed to be constantly calculating our options. Finally, when we were sure the men were far enough away, we emerged from our hiding spot. "Carlos," Mom said immediately, "explain what's going on." Now Dad looked at me. I nodded. We could no longer keep the secret. He told them everything. He described what we'd seen in the clearing, the tied-up man, the 2 attackers, the torture, our desperate escape. He explained that the men had been searching for us ever since. When he finished, the clearing was completely silent, except for the sound of the running water. "My God," Mom whispered. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to get out of this forest," Dad said with determination. "But we can't follow the stream. It's too obvious. We need to find another way." The problem was that all the alternatives were worse. Without the stream as a guide, we'd be navigating blindly through a dense forest with an injured person pursued by killers. What about going up? I suggested. Instead of following the water downstream, we could head up to the higher ridges. From there, we might see farther, maybe find a landmark to orient ourselves. Dad considered the idea. It's risky, he said. We'll be more exposed on higher ground, but you're right. It would give us a better view of the area. We decided to try it. We left the stream and began climbing toward the higher elevations. The terrain was much tougher, especially for Mom with her injured ankle, but at least it wasn't as predictable as following the water. The climb was brutal. The forest grew denser as we ascended, and we had to push through vegetation that clearly hadn't been disturbed by humans in years, maybe decades. Marcos helped Mom as much as he could, but she was clearly in pain. Every step caused her visible agony, but she refused to complain or ask to stop. After about 3 hours of climbing, we finally reached a rocky outcrop that gave us a clear view of the valley below. And what we saw made my stomach drop. Smoke. Multiple columns of smoke rising from different points in the forest. "What's that?" Marcos asked. Dad studied the smoke columns through the binoculars he carried in his backpack. "Campfires," he said finally. "Lots of campfires." "Other campers?" Mom asked hopefully. Dad shook his head slowly. "They're not in places where normal people would camp. They're spread out like they're patrolling." The realization hit us all at once. It wasn't just two men searching for us. It was a larger group, and they had us surrounded. "How many do you think there are?" I asked. "From the number of fires, at least 6 or 7. We were in a desperate situation, surrounded by killers in a forest we didn't know, with an injured person and limited supplies. "We need to make a decision," Dad said after several minutes of silence. "We can try to break through their perimeter at night when it'll be harder for them to see us. Or we can find a place to hide and wait for them to leave." "And if they don't leave?" Mom asked. It was a question none of us wanted to consider, but it was valid. How long would these men be willing to search for us? Days? Weeks? "There's a third option," I said slowly, an idea forming in my mind. "What if one of us manages to escape and get help?" "Absolutely not," Dad said immediately. "We're not splitting up." "Dad, think about it," I insisted. "One person alone can move faster and more quietly. Mom can't walk much farther with that ankle. If someone reaches a road and brings help, it's too risky. Riskier than staying here, waiting for them to find us." Mom spoke before Dad could respond. "Eleanor's right," she said softly. "Someone has to go for help. If anyone's going, it'll be me," Dad said. "No," Mom said firmly. "You know the area best. If something happens to me, you'll need to guide the kids. Eleanor should go. I'm not sending my 17-year-old daughter alone through a forest full of killers." "Dad," I said, "I'm the fastest. I know the forest almost as well as you. And if they catch me—" I didn't finish the sentence. We all knew what would happen if I got caught. "There's another reason," Mom added softly. "If they find the 3 of us and Elena's gone, at least one of us has a chance of surviving." The silence that followed was deafening. Mom had voiced what we were all thinking, but no one dared to say. After a long discussion, Dad finally agreed to the plan. We'd wait until nightfall, then I'd try to break through the men's perimeter and find a road. Once I found help, I'd return with the police. The next few hours were the tensest of my life. We hid in a small cave we'd found near the rocky outcrop, waiting for darkness. No one spoke much. Every forest sound made us jump. Dad gave me his compass and explained the direction I should take. "Head southwest," he told me, pointing at the map. "According to this, there's a secondary road about 15 kilometers in that direction. If you keep a steady pace, You should reach it before dawn. 15 kilometers didn't sound like much, but through an unfamiliar forest, in the dark, avoiding armed men, it felt like an impossible distance. When it finally got dark enough, we said our goodbyes. Mom hugged me so tightly, I thought she'd never let go. "Be careful, my love," she whispered in my ear. "Stay low, move slowly, and if you hear anything, don't run unless it's absolutely necessary. Running makes noise." Marcos hugged me too, though he tried to act like he wasn't scared. "You'll be fine," he said, but his voice trembled. "You're the bravest person I know." Dad was the last. He gave me his multi-tool knife and his smallest flashlight. "Use it only if absolutely necessary," he said about the flashlight. "And Elena, if something goes wrong, if you're surrounded or trapped, run. Don't try to be heroic. Just run and get help. Don't worry about us." I knew he was giving me permission to abandon them if it meant saving my own life. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to hear. I left the cave just after midnight. The nighttime forest was an entirely different world. With no moon, it was cloudy. The darkness was nearly absolute. I had to move by feel, step by step, checking each surface before putting my weight on it. The first few kilometers were the most terrifying. I knew I was near the area where we'd seen the campfires, where the men were patrolling. Every branch that snapped under my feet sounded like a gunshot in the night silence. About 2 kilometers from the cave, I saw the first light. It was a flashlight, moving slowly through the trees about 100 meters from my position. I immediately crouched behind a large tree and watched. The light moved in a systematic pattern, left to right, as if someone was searching a specific area. After several minutes, the light began moving away in a direction perpendicular to my route. I waited until I could no longer see the light before continuing. But now I knew for certain the men were still there, still searching. Over the next few hours, I saw lights at least 5 more times. Once, a flashlight passed so close, I could hear the footsteps of the person carrying it. I stayed perfectly still behind a bush, holding my breath as the man passed less than 10 meters from my position. It was the most terrifying experience of my life up to that point. I could hear his breathing, the sound of his clothes brushing against branches, even smell the cigarette smoke on his clothing. If he'd chosen to check my specific bush, he would have found me. But he kept going, and after waiting another 10 minutes, I continued my journey. The terrain grew tougher as I went on. There were more streams to cross, more steep slopes to climb or descend. Unable to use my flashlight, I relied entirely on touch to navigate, which made progress painfully slow. It was around 4 in the morning when I finally heard something that filled me with hope. The distant sound of a car. I'd found a road, but when I finally reached the edge of the forest and could see the road, I realized I had a new problem. It was a very small road, likely used mainly by forestry workers and maintenance vehicles. There was no regular traffic, especially not at 4 in the morning. I sat in the ditch, exhausted and unsure what to do. I could wait for a car to pass, but that might take hours. Meanwhile, my family was still hiding in the forest, with killers searching for them. I decided to start walking along the road, hoping to find a house, a gas station, or somewhere I could get help. I walked for about an hour before I saw lights in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was a small gas station, closed, but with security lights on. There was a payphone next to the building. With trembling hands, I dialed 112. When the operator answered, the words poured out of me in a desperate rush. "My family is lost in the forest, and there are men trying to kill us," I said, without pausing to breathe. "I need help. Please, I need help now." The operator calmed me down and asked me to give the details slowly. I told her everything: where we'd been camping, how we'd gotten lost, what Dad and I had seen in the clearing, how the men had been chasing us. "Where are you right now?" she asked. I described the gas station and the road I was on. "Stay exactly where you are," she told me. "We're sending Guardia Civil patrols immediately. Don't move from there." The next 20 minutes were eternal. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow could have been one of the men from the forest. I was terrified they'd followed me to the road. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance, approaching quickly. 3 Guardia Civil cars arrived almost simultaneously, followed by an ambulance and what looked like a special operations vehicle. The officers had me get into one of the cars immediately while I repeated my story. The sergeant in charge, an older man with serious eyes, took detailed notes of everything I said. "Can you take us back to where you left your family?" he asked. "I think so," I said, "but it'll be hard to find the exact cave in the dark." "We have night vision equipment," he assured me, "and tracking dogs are on the way." The trip back to the forest was surreal. I was in the back seat of a Guardia Civil car, being driven back to the same forest I'd fought so desperately to escape just hours before. When we reached the edge of the forest, there were at least 15 officers waiting, plus search and rescue teams with dogs. It was a massive operation. "Before we go in," the sergeant told me, "I need you to understand that if there really are armed men in this forest, this could become a very dangerous situation. You'll stay with 2 officers at all times, and if I say to pull back, you pull back immediately. Understood?" I nodded. We entered the forest like a small military unit. The officers had automatic weapons, bulletproof vests, and sophisticated communication equipment. Some wore helmets with night vision cameras. Guiding the officers back to the cave was harder than I'd expected. In the dark, with my state of exhaustion and stress, many parts of the forest looked the same. But gradually, recognizing certain trees and rock formations, I managed to lead us in the right direction. It was when we were about 1 kilometer from the cave that one of the dogs started alerting. "Something's ahead," the dog handler whispered. "Possibly humans." The officers immediately deployed into a tactical formation. They had me stay back with 2 guards while the rest moved forward cautiously. Over the next few minutes, I could hear radio communications, but I couldn't make out specific words. Then I heard something that made my heart stop. Shouts. Not screams of pain or fear, but shouts of "Police! Get on the ground!" A confrontation had begun. The next few minutes were chaotic. I heard more shouts, the sound of people running through the forest, and then terrifyingly, gunshots. 3 gunshots, spaced several seconds apart. Then silence. One of the guards with me spoke into his radio. "Control, we need a status update." The response came several seconds later. 3 suspects in custody. 1 suspect fled. Area secured. The family is safe. My family was safe. They took me to the cave where they'd been hiding. Dad, Mom, and Marcos were sitting on a rock, surrounded by officers, but clearly unharmed. When they saw me, they all ran toward me. "Elena," Mom cried, hugging me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I thought I'd never see you again." "Are you all okay?" I asked, checking each of them for injuries. "We're fine," Dad said. "The officers got here just in time. The men had found our cave, but when they saw the police flashlights, most of them ran." "Most of them?" "They caught 3, the sergeant explained, approaching us. "1 escaped, but we have helicopters searching the area." He won't get far. Over the next few days, we gradually learned more about what we'd stumbled upon. The 4 men were part of a criminal network that had been operating in the area for months. They'd been kidnapping hikers and campers, taking them to remote forest locations to rob them, and in some cases, murder them. The man Dad and I had seen being tortured was a businessman from Santander who had come to the area for a solo hike. He had survived, but was severely injured. The men had been trying to force him to give them access codes to his bank accounts. The police found evidence of at least 6 prior murders, all hikers or campers who had gone missing in the area over the past 2 years. They'd been using the forest as their personal hunting ground. If Dad and I hadn't stumbled upon their operation, if we hadn't escaped to get help, my family would likely have been their next victims. The man who had escaped during the raid was caught 3 days later, trying to cross the border into Portugal. He turned out to be the group's leader, an ex-convict with a history of violence dating back decades. During his interrogation, he admitted they had planned to hold us hostage to negotiate their escape if they were discovered. The thought made me nauseous. He also confirmed something I'd been suspecting. They had been watching our campsite since our first day in the forest. They'd noticed we were a family with children, which made us ideal targets for their purposes. If the girl hadn't escaped, he told the police, we would have waited until they were sleeping and taken them all. We finally returned to Madrid a week later than originally planned. The trip back was very different from the trip out. No one joked, no one fought over the music. We were all lost in our own thoughts, processing what we'd been through. Over the next few weeks, we had to give extensive statements to the police. I testified at the trial of the 4 men, describing once again what I'd seen in that clearing. It was hard to relive the details, but I knew it was important to ensure they were convicted. All 4 received long prison sentences. The leader, the one who had escaped, got life in prison for multiple counts of murder. For months after the incident, I had nightmares almost every night. I dreamed I was back in the forest, lost, with voices calling from the darkness. I dreamed the men had found me, that I'd never managed to escape. My parents took me to a psychologist specializing in trauma, who helped me process what I'd been through. She explained that what I'd experienced was what professionals call survivor's trauma, the guilt and confusion sometimes felt by people who survive situations where others aren't so lucky. You didn't do anything wrong, she told me repeatedly. You saved your family. You were incredibly brave, but for a long time, I didn't feel brave. I felt like I'd been lucky, like things could have turned out very differently with small changes. The experience changed our entire family in profound ways. Dad never planned adventurous camping trips again. When we went camping after that, it was always at official campsites with lots of other people around. Mom developed anxiety about letting Marcos or me go out alone. For years, she insisted on knowing exactly where we were at all times. Marcos, who was only 14 when this happened, became more serious, more cautious. The experience had forced him to grow up fast. For me, the biggest change was a new appreciation for how fragile safety can be. Before that experience, I'd never really considered that the world could be a dangerous place. I'd grown up feeling safe and protected, assuming that as long as I was careful and followed the rules, I'd be fine. That experience taught me that sometimes danger finds a way to reach you, no matter how careful you are. As the years passed, I gradually became able to talk about the experience without feeling immediate panic. The nightmares became less frequent, though they never completely stopped. I majored in criminology in college, partly motivated by my experience. I wanted to better understand how the minds of people like the men we'd encountered in the forest worked. During my college career, I wrote my thesis on crimes in rural and remote areas. My professor, who knew my personal story, helped me channel my experience into useful academic research. "You've lived something most criminologists only study in books," she told me. "That perspective is valuable." Over the years, many people have asked me why I never spoke publicly about what happened. Journalists contacted my family several times, wanting to do stories about our incredible survival story. I always declined. The reason is simple. Some experiences are too personal, too intimate in their horror to be shared with strangers. What we went through in that forest belongs to my family and me. It's not entertainment for others. There were also practical considerations. Though the 4 men were in prison, they had connections in the criminal world. Keeping a low profile seemed like the safest option. But more than that, speaking about the experience publicly would have made it real in a different way. I would have had to relive the details over and over again for journalists, for documentarians, for curious people. I preferred to keep it a private memory, something I processed on my own terms. One of the hardest parts of this whole process was meeting the family of the man we'd seen being tortured. His name was Miguel Rodriguez, and he had 2 young children and a wife. His wife, Carmen, contacted me after the trial to thank me. It was one of the most emotional conversations of my life. "If you hadn't found him," she told me, "Miguel would have died in that forest, and we would never have known what happened to him." Miguel had survived, but he'd suffered severe injuries that left him with permanent disabilities. The men had broken several of his ribs, dislocated his shoulder, and left extensive scars from the knife cuts. But he was alive, and that's what mattered. Now, 15 years later, I can reflect on that experience with a perspective I didn't have at 17. I realized that life can change completely in seconds. One moment you can be enjoying a normal family vacation, and the next you can be fighting for your life. I also learned that people are capable of incredible things when they have no other choice. Before that experience, I never would have thought I'd be capable of walking alone through a dark forest filled with killers. But when the alternative was letting my family die, I found strength I didn't know I had. The experience also taught me about the importance of trusting instincts. When Dad and I first heard those voices, something told us they weren't friendly. If we'd ignored that feeling, if we'd walked straight toward them, asking for help, we would have walked right into a trap. And here's the secret I've kept for 15 years, the one I've never told anyone, not even my family. While running through the forest that night, seeking help, I had a moment where I considered not going back. It was when I was sitting in the ditch by that rural road, exhausted and terrified, waiting to hear the sound of a car. For a moment, just a moment, I thought about walking down that road in the opposite direction, away from everything, finding the nearest police station and simply telling them my family had gone missing. It would have been easier. It would have been safe. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. I knew I couldn't abandon my family, no matter how scared I was. I've never told anyone about that moment of doubt, those few seconds when I considered running away instead of going back to help. I'm ashamed I even thought about it, even if it was